Hello again, my dear. Here is your lesson for A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. Your lesson objectives are to make inferences, that's an educated guess, and draw conclusions or make decisions about the author's purpose and cultural and historical contexts, and provide evidence from the text to support your analysis. So as you're thinking about that, I want you to know a little bit more about Betty Smith. She was one glamorous lady. Her original name was Elizabeth Lillian Weiner. She was actually a, a German immigrant. Her parents were both German immigrants. She was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1896, and she grew up in a poor section of Brooklyn called Williamsburg, and this was where a lot of German immigrants were. But at the time she was living there and growing up there were also a lot of Jewish immigrants and Italian immigrants coming in. So there was a lot of change, and the population of Williamsburg in Brooklyn actually doubled during that time. Betty wrote novels and plays. She died in 1972, and she wrote A Tree Grows in Brooklyn in 1943. It carries motifs popular with Americans. Motifs are ideas that keep coming up, and one of those is the American dream. Sorry, my cat's having a moment right now. And of course, working class people. These are very popular with Americans. The style, there's a very particular style of writing here. It's a coming of age story, and there is a German term called a Bildungsroman. So a Bildungsroman is a growing up story or a coming of age story, and that's what A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is. She's got a colloquial style, which means that it's very familiar to that time and place. She uses some terminology that's very common and language that's very ordinary for that setting, something that people growing up in her corner of the world at that time would totally relate to. She recreates the time period. So let's talk about it. The historical context of the novel is that it takes place between 1899 and 1918, which is pre to post World War I. At this time, the population of her neighborhood more than doubled, and lots more and different kinds of immigrants were moving there. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of change going on. She grew up in a borough of New York. Brooklyn is a borough, so if you think about the actual city of New York being, let me see if I can give you an example here. If you think about the boroughs as being kind of surrounding the island of Manhattan. So you've got Manhattan here, which is what we really think, and that big green thing is Central Park. And then you think about all these different places, like this is Brooklyn, this right here is Queens, and that's a lot of neighborhoods and stuff like that over there. This is the Bronx. This is Staten Island. So you've got different areas of and kind of like outskirts of New York City, and those are called boroughs. And hers was, of course, Brooklyn, which is over here. And there's a section of Brooklyn called Williamsburg, and that's where she grew up. She was the child of German immigrants, so that's important to know as well. And each borough, as you visit it, you'll notice has its own flavor and culture. Smith's purpose for writing. There are three main kinds of authors' purposes. They might be informing us, persuading us, or entertaining us, and sometimes it's a combination of a couple of those. As you read, I want you to determine why you think Smith is writing this. An author's style has to do a lot with diction, which means word choice. She uses colloquialisms, which are terms that were common in that time and place. You'll notice that she says kids on the day of Thanksgiving, they went around ragamuffin, which meant that they were kind of roughly dressed, and some of them, it was almost like Thanksgiving was the day that you did your trick-or-treating, sort of a different culture than we have now. We separate those two holidays, but they kind of combined them. And then syntax is sentence structure. This is how an author will structure and arrange the words and phrases within a sentence. Her style is very accessible and familiar. It would have been colloquial, which means it would have been typical of that era and of that time and place. The theme, you're probably pretty familiar with the idea of a literary theme. That's the message or main insight that's revealed by a story. This is usually what the author wants us to understand about ourselves or the world. As you read this excerpt from the novel, think about what Smith is trying to tell us, what her theme is, and what is she saying about human nature that's still true today. When you get a chance, I want you to follow this link, your hyperlink. Oops, okay. I would like you to, okay, I will fix that and make sure to get that back to you. But as you're reading, I want you to think about a couple of things. What do you think Smith's purpose is for writing this story? What textual evidence can you use when you're making a point about your reading? Now, you're not going to have to write about this, but if you were, you could summarize, you could paraphrase, or you could quote a portion of the text. Those are all good ways to take evidence from the text and make a point about it. What possible themes can we find in the text? Things won't always stay the way we want them to be. Childhood is a time to learn life's lessons. These are great examples of possible themes. And then there are some things I'd like you to know about narrating a life lesson. I think you would be awesome at this because you are a triple threat. You've got lots of talent in this area. Sequence your events. First of all, if you were to tell the story of a life lesson that you've learned, something important that's happened in your life, what story would you want to tell? I'd be interested to know. And then how would you tell it? Usually we tell something that happened in our lives in chronological order, meaning first, second, third time order. What background information would your audience need to understand in order to understand your life lesson narrative? What were the main events that happened? And of course, this is one important thing that you always want to know is what was the significance? Why is this an important life lesson for you? And how do you use this life lesson today? When you present your narratives, I would always hope that you would use movement, facial expression, projection, vocal variety, and I know you would because you're very talented at that. Okay, so I'm going to fix this and get this off to you. I'll get a better link for the excerpt, but for now, that's the main idea of what you need to know about A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Thanks for watching.